But if I were going to start talking about Japanese Americans in World War II, I'd start with a statistic. In 1940, if you look at the 1940 census, there were about 127,000 Japanese Americans in the continental United States. And like most immigrant groups, they weren't kind of scattered randomly across the country, but they tended to cluster together in certain places. And for Japanese Americans, that's almost entirely on the West Coast. So you can find about 90% of the Japanese American population of the continental United States in 1940 living in either California, Oregon, or Washington. So the question really for a presentation like this is, how is it that such an infinitesimally small population could inspire so much fear and so much hatred that they're going to be sent to concentration camps during World War II? The answer, the historian Roger Daniels tells us, does not rest with the victims. We're never going to understand what happened to Japanese Americans by studying their actions. We need to instead study the actions of the larger society. And I'm a historian, so to understand that, we have to actually step back before 1940 a little bit. So here's as brief a background as I can give you. Japanese immigrants began to arrive in the United States in large numbers or in significant numbers starting around 1890 or so. And they arrived to face immediate discrimination in the United States. Americans had already learned to kind of hate Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans, and they would very kind of easily transfer that kind of prejudice against Chinese newcomers to the Japanese. The first generation of Japanese Americans who settle are called the Issei. And it's worth kind of thinking about their experience. They left Japan, again, much of the Japanese immigration experience is very common to immigrants, to immigration history more broadly. In the late 19th century, Japan is modernizing economically at a really rapid pace, and there are kind of winners in that process, and there are losers, people who can't get ahead or make ends meet economically. And those who kind of are suffering economically start to look for other opportunities, and they see in the United States economic opportunity. And so you start seeing them arrive in the United States. As the Issei arrive, almost all of them start at the bottom of the economic ladder, but they very quickly and somewhat surprisingly enjoy some levels of economic success. By 1919, half of the Japanese American population is engaged in agriculture. They're farming 1% of the land under cultivation in California. They're producing 10% of the state's agricultural profits. So they're over successful in terms of the work they're doing. But you shouldn't think of them as rich. They think of them as like having kind of a steady but unspectacular kind of economic success, either as farmers or in the countryside, or also those who are like living in cities are kind of moving from being day laborers to owning small businesses. They don't represent any kind of a real threat to the United States, certainly not economically to Americans. But very quickly, anti-Japanese racism births an anti-Japanese movement. So by 1900, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Populist Party, they had all adopted strong stands against Asian immigration. And this kind of growing anti-Asian sentiment peaked in 1906. Maybe you've talked about this. I don't know where you're at in your classes with Mr. Grabos. But in 1906, the San Francisco School Board announced that it was going to segregate all Japanese American students. Up to this point, they had been going to school with white students. And in 1906, the school board in San Francisco says, we're not going to allow that anymore. We're going to send Japanese Americans to segregated schools. The president at the time was Teddy Roosevelt. And he was really furious at this decision by the San Francisco School Board for very practical reasons. Teddy Roosevelt understood that Japan, by 1906, is a rising power in the world. Like, you can't afford to offend the Japanese for no reason. He's looking to try to find some way to get along with them. And so Roosevelt is furious. He has to figure out a solution to this problem. So he enters into negotiations with the Japanese government, and they eventually craft an agreement. It's called the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, 1908. And what the Gentleman's Agreement does is, like, both sides get something. Roosevelt persuades the San Francisco School Board not to segregate Japanese American students. So the Japanese are kind of saved this insult to their honor and their sense of their rightful standing in the world. In exchange, the Japanese government promised to stop issuing passports to Japanese laborers. So in effect, if you're a Japanese laborer and you want to come to the United States, you have to get that passport. So as long as the Japanese government refuses to give laborers passports, there's no more immigration to the United States from Japan, except for like small groups of people, a couple of businessmen, some academics. But really, the gentleman's agreement is going to stop the flow of Japanese immigration in 1908. But the deal had some fine print in it that Americans didn't understand the consequences of. The deal said that the Japanese would not issue passports to laborers, but that it could issue passports to their parents, to their wives, or to their kids currently living in Japan. So Americans are pretty happy with this deal initially. They're like, we don't want Japanese immigration. The Japanese immigration has been stopped. But they didn't realize what that fine print was going to do, because a lot of these Japanese immigrants in the United States, they were lonely. They wanted to have wives. They wanted to have kids. They wanted to build families and lives. And so they start getting married by proxy, which means they wouldn't travel back to Japan, but they would marry somebody they had never met. They'd only seen a picture of. Thus, you guys have heard of picture brides? Maybe like this is the idea of picture brides, that you never actually meet the woman you're going to marry, but you're married in this ceremony that you don't attend in Japan. But now all of a sudden she's your wife, which means what? She can get a passport and come to the United States. So Americans had imagined that Japanese immigration was going to be largely cut off, but this loophole kind of allows Japanese American or Japanese women to immigrate to join their husbands. Feeling cheated, Californians do what I guess legislators always do. They're like, we need some kind of revenge. So in 1913 and then in 1920, the California legislature starts passing laws that prevent Japanese Americans from owning land. They're upset. They're kind of jealous of Japanese American success, so they begin to target them. And then in 1924, and then we'll be almost to the war. In 1924, Congress completely revamps American immigration law. It's called the National Origins Act. In many ways, it was an act that targeted Southern and Eastern Europeans. In particular, people were really unhappy that Italians and Poles and Slovaks and groups like this were coming in large numbers. But the act also barred what it called aliens ineligible for citizenship from immigrating. So you cannot come to the United States if you are ineligible to be a citizen. And you may or may not know, but in 1924, to become an American citizen, you had to meet one of two criteria. You had to be white or you had to be of African descent. So when the law in 1924 all of a sudden says aliens ineligible from citizenship cannot immigrate, it essentially ended not only Japanese immigration, but it ended Asian immigration to the United States until World War II, where things start to change. So the problem from the Americans' point of view is that the Immigration Act comes too late. Too many picture brides have arrived, and the Japanese American community is growing just kind of through natural increase. People are having kids, and we get a new generation, the second generation called Nisei. So we've got the Issei, the original immigrants. They tend to be kind of Japan-centered. They're barred from becoming American citizens. But the Nisei, their kids are very America-centered. They're always looking to America. They're assimilating very thoroughly, largely because they're going to public schools. And you may or may not know, but public schools are one of the great assimilating forces in American history. Like when immigrants' kids go to school, they start losing the old world culture and they start adopting the new. And the Nisei were incredibly successful in school. Their parents really stressed the importance of getting a good education. They go to college. There's kind of my first book comes out of these college students is what I studied. But when they graduate, they face a really ugly reality in America, that they're academically really accomplished, but there aren't jobs available that kind of are commensurate to what they've achieved because discrimination. Nonetheless, despite this kind of unfair treatment, the Nisei are generally very patriotic. But that does them virtually no good when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. So now, World War II. Immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the FBI began to round up a group of suspected, what they called enemy aliens. So an alien is a person living in the United States who's not a citizen. An enemy, obviously, member of a nation that we're at war with. It was a really unsophisticated search. They just kind of arrested a bunch of community leaders. If you were a priest in the Japanese American community, the FBI was going to round you up. If you were teaching in a Japanese language school, if you were the editor of a Japanese American newspaper, all of these things would be sufficient to get you thrown into camp. By mid-February, about 2,000 Japanese Americans were in these internment camps. About 1,400 German Americans were in them, and about 250 Italian Americans. So Mr. Grybos started by calling it Japanese American internment. I would argue that what we're talking about really is an internment, because there's only a couple thousand Japanese Americans who are interned. Everybody else who was thrown into a camp is done outside of the process of internment, which is what I want to focus on today. The rest of the Japanese American community, like I said, about 125,000 Japanese Americans, find out that even though they're not being interned, they're going to be thrown into these concentration camps. Why? Well, a government report in the 1980s identified 4 reasons. Wartime hysteria.
It cut you off for like 10 seconds.
Okay, so wartime hysteria, a long history of anti-Japanese hostility fueled by economic competition, racism, and a failure of political leadership. I want to focus on that failure of political leadership in a minute. But in the first 6 months of the war, the Japanese are running like wild across the Pacific. Pretty much anywhere they can get, they can take. And Americans are panicked, and they're reading all of these newspapers that are printing as fact wild rumors about Japanese American complicity. It's not true, but it's ginning up this public anxiety and this public hatred of Japanese Americans. And eventually the lead general for the West Coast, a guy named John DeWitt, decides that all the Japanese Americans have to be evacuated, right? He's convinced. So he sends a letter in February to the White House saying we need to remove all Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Now, here's the failure of political leadership. Any number of American leaders knew that Japanese Americans did not need to be removed. They knew that they were not a security threat, including J. Edgar Hoover. You guys know Hoover, right? The director of the FBI. And trust me, like a very paranoid guy. Even J. Edgar Hoover was saying, like, Japanese Americans are not a threat to national security. It wasn't just Hoover. The Attorney General, Francis Biddle, agreed. He had read documents. He had done investigations. He knew there was no threat. The president himself, Franklin Roosevelt, the War Department, the Office of Naval Intelligence, all of these organizations and people had reports that directly stated that Japanese Americans were not a threat, and yet Japanese Americans were removed anyway. I think because it was politically expedient. It was just the easy thing for Roosevelt to do. And so on February 19th, Mr. Grybos would tell you I'm not a historian that thinks like memorizing a bunch of names and dates matters. But if there's one date that matters in this story, it's February 19th, 1942, when Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066 into law. The executive order said that the War Department could designate military areas from which any or all persons could be excluded. That's all it said, right? The military, like the War Department, can designate an area and then require that people be removed from it. The executive order never named Japanese Americans. It never said this is for Japanese Americans, but it was applied only to Japanese Americans during the war. Like nobody else is going to be removed as a result. And so the government begins this process that goes through 2 stages. The camps aren't ready initially. So initially, Japanese Americans are shipped off to what are called assembly centers that are run by the military. Most of these were like racetracks. So if you want to do some Google image searching afterwards, look up Santa Anita Racetrack, and you can see the way in which the racetrack is transformed into housing for, like, I can't remember, 25,000 Japanese Americans. If you read their firsthand accounts, they talk repeatedly of literally being able to smell the horses that had lived in the stables right before they were put into them. It's really uncomfortable. They stay there for several months before they're moved to the more permanent 10 concentration camps run by the War Relocation. A couple of quick points about this process, and then I'll let you ask some questions. Japanese Americans were told when they were forcibly removed from their homes that they could take with them only what they could carry. Everything else had to be sold. Like, you had to liquidate your entire life. So Japanese Americans had to sell their businesses, their homes, their cars, their prized possessions, and they were selling it in a buyer's market, right? Everybody knew Japanese Americans were leaving. Everybody knew they had to get rid of this stuff. And so they get literally pennies on the dollar. They sell all of their stuff for a fraction of what it's actually worth. But it's not just the economic loss. Imagine you're a college student and your education is interrupted. Imagine that you're a lawyer and your career is interrupted. A businessman or a farmer, you're going to lose your company or your land. Like, all of these losses accrue for Japanese Americans, but many will tell you today that worse than all of that was the stigma that was placed upon them, that everybody saw them as disloyal. And as a result, they lost their liberty. There were a couple of Japanese Americans, you can look them up if you want to, Gordon Hirabayashi and Fred Korematsu, who challenged the legality of their forced removal. The Supreme Court ruled against both of them. The Supreme Court during the war said that forcibly removing American citizens from their home was, in fact, constitutional. As they kind of moved to these camps, they were built, I should point out, in what one historian has described as God-forsaken areas. Like, the camps were in deserts and swamps, brutally humid, hot summers, brutally cold winters, omnipresent dust. There's some great firsthand accounts you can read if you want to. An average family of 6 was given a living space that measured 20 by 25 feet. So you can imagine, like, taking your entire family of 6 and compressing them into that space. The barracks that they lived in didn't have any indoor plumbing, so they were all communal bathrooms that you had to walk to. And yet, Japanese American protest was fairly rare. Korematsu and Hirabayashi make legal challenges. There were occasional protests inside the camps. But for the most part, Japanese Americans kind of endured it, feeling like they didn't have many better options. So finally, the government did eventually implement some leave programs. So one of the first groups to leave, thus my book, were college students. The government saw college students as really well assimilated and thought they would fit well in the Midwest, in the East Coast. You could also leave for jobs if you had a guarantee of employment. And believe it or not, you could leave for military service, because in 1943, the government came to the camps and said to these Nisei men who they had thrown into camps, we would like you to volunteer to fight in Europe as part of a segregated unit. And so it's a very famous military unit. They're known as the 442nd. They are incredibly well awarded. Some Japanese Americans volunteer to fight, and they volunteer to fight with the reasoning that the only way we can prove our loyalty to this country, the only way white Americans will accept us, is if we risk our lives, if we give our lives for the country. Other Japanese American young men, as you might imagine, were like, to hell with that. Like, there's no way I am going to go volunteer to fight for a country that has thrown me and my parents and my family into a concentration camp and kind of robbed us of our fundamental constitutional rights. It gets worse. The next year in 1944, the government says not enough people have volunteered, and they actually start drafting Japanese Americans, young Nisei men, out of the concentration camps and forcing them to fight. This leads to a draft resistance movement that really splits the community. Again, some Japanese Americans think we have to serve. It's our only way to prove our loyalty. Other Japanese Americans absolutely refuse to fight for a country that has done this to them. By the end of the war, there are still Japanese Americans in camps, but they're finally closed in 1946. But final point, that doesn't mean that the trauma of the camps went away. It's clear that Japanese American history after the camps is haunted by the wartime experience. It's probably worth noting that President Ronald Reagan in 1988 signed legislation that officially apologized to Japanese Americans for their mistreatment during World War II. That legislation also provided payments of $20,000 per survivor. So if you had been in the camps but died before 1989, you don't get any money. But if you're still alive in 1989, when the checks get cut, the government pays $20,000. The idea of the check was that it couldn't possibly cover the economic losses of the war, but that the money was a way of making the apologies seem like it was really meant in a way. But Japanese Americans, in the aftermath even of what they call redress, which is this apology and payment, have continued to be active ever since. About a week ago, on the 19th, every year, Japanese Americans hold a commemoration. They call it the Day of Remembrance, where they hold gatherings and ceremonies where they try to remember what happened during the war, to keep it alive so that people kind of are not to forget the history that Japanese Americans experienced. There's some really great organizations who do work like that. If you're at all interested in the subject, online, there's a website called Densho, DENSHO, that does really terrific stuff. If I were teaching a high school class, for instance, they've got all kinds of oral histories that have been videotaped, and you can hear Japanese Americans kind of telling their own story, which is kind of the fundamental thing to do in history.